People in southern Lebanon have received evacuation orders. Israel says Shia Muslims can't return until fighting stops.
You're seeing them actually call out the Shiites by name. I mean, before it was said that if you were Hezbollah, etc. Now the rhetoric is such that they are talking about an entire sect.
I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. Today, an update from Lebanon. Also in El Salvador, life sentences used to be prohibited.
This is one of the final things in the penal code that at least allowed for people who were incarcerated to have a semblance of possibly getting out.
New exceptions have critics fearing the worst.
Plus, in Vienna, subsidized housing seems to be working.
I mean, we have the whole garden area for us. It's pretty cool because our kids love to go outside and snack some strawberries.
So what's the problem? Find out today on The World.
This is The World. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. Thank you for joining us. We start today's show in Lebanon, where Israel is sharply escalating its attacks. Airstrikes have hit central Beirut in parts of the city previously considered safe.
This morning, a strike collapsed an entire apartment building in the Bakura neighborhood. Residents were given 1 hour to grab their belongings and flee. Israel is also intensifying its operations in southern Lebanon, where they're sending limited ground troops and ramping up airstrikes. The Israeli military say they're targeting the infrastructure and personnel of Hezbollah, the militant group backed by Iran. 1 million people have now been displaced by the fighting in Lebanon, according to aid groups.
Nabi Boulos is the Middle East bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times, based in Beirut. I spoke with him earlier today. He said parts of Beirut, once considered safe, are no longer secure.
In the Bashura neighborhood, in Hamra, in the places where the displaced have gone, right, there's, of course, a real fear that this building that they're in will be the next target, right, and what that would imply. Now, of course, we're seeing traffic in those areas. I mean, already it's snarled because of just the influx of the displaced. And you can imagine that if something were to happen, I mean, it would be, of course, absolute bedlam. So, yes, there is a fear there. There is this sort of electricity and tension right now, because the question is, I mean, where will these people go if something else happens?
These are people displaced from the south that are now flooding into Beirut.
Well, south, but also from the southern suburbs of Beirut itself, right, which is also a Hezbollah-dominated area, right? So you're talking about a lot of people, really hundreds of thousands at this point in Beirut alone.
Does this feel different than previous conflicts with Israel?
I mean, in the last war, right, you could sort of feel somewhat safe in the neighborhood I'm in, for example, right? But increasingly, right, because the scope of these attacks has increased, there's a feeling that nowhere is safe. And so once that happens, then the question is, okay, will those areas, for example, require that anyone from the south is not allowed to visit, right? Will it become sort of more sectarian, that if you're of a certain sect, you cannot come to this area? I mean, it becomes a very ugly situation when you try to think of those things and what they're going to mean in the future.
Becoming more sectarian, do you mean that people living in certain areas will bar people from the south to resettle there because they're concerned about being targeted by Israel?
Well, for one thing, I mean, quite openly, the other day, the Israeli defense minister said that as long as the Shiites of the south of Lebanon, I mean, as long as there's fighting, he said that the Shiites of the south of Lebanon won't be able to return home. Now, this is a clear a situation where you're seeing them actually call out the Shiites by name, right? I mean, before it was said that if you were Hezbollah, etc. I mean, now the rhetoric is such that they are talking about an entire sect. I mean, you can see, obviously, the problem that is brewing here.
Yeah.
I mean, the country right now has this influx of Shiite Muslims from the south. At the same time as there is a real fear of them, right, and turning the place into a target. So obviously you have this, I suppose, ratcheting of sectarian tensions.
So let's go back to the south where you just were. Can you give me an overview of what the Israeli military is doing there right now?
Well, so actually today I had gone to the city of Tyre, and this is the largest city in the south of Lebanon. And there was a blanket evacuation order for it last night, in fact. And so I wanted to go see what was happening there today. And as you can imagine, the city, I mean, it was already partially emptied. But now, of course, there are people who are just trying to find some place to shelter at this point. And they're, of course, terrified of an impending Israeli invasion. At the same time, actually, as I was leaving, the Israeli Air Force was starting to bomb bridges into South Lebanon. So we are seeing the start of the isolation of South Lebanon as a region from the rest of the country.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, Israeli military has been already occupying parts of the south even before this particular conflagration began, let's be clear. Now, how much they've advanced is a matter of debate. There is talk that they have reached the second line of border villages, right, in border areas, which would imply that they're in for like 3 kilometers or so. But again, it's really quite unclear. At the same time, right, there has been a ramping up of airstrikes, and the targeting has widened to include infrastructure like roads, etc., hospitals and things of that nature, things that sustain life.
Civilian infrastructure.
Yes, civilian infrastructure. And so what that means is, of course, that people cannot stay. I mean, if your intention is to empty out an area, you're going to hit that kind of infrastructure to get them out. And for example, today in Tyre, right, there was talk of a targeting of gas stations. So that 4 gas stations have been hit. And you can imagine how important that is as well. Now, again, in all this, Israel is saying that it's targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. But at the same time, if, for example, this gas station is owned by someone who is perhaps peripherally aligned with Hezbollah or related to someone in Hezbollah, I mean, you can see how that spreads and becomes a bigger issue. So this is where we are now.
And just to remind, Tyre is that city in southern Lebanon where Israel has said everyone needs to leave. What did you hear today from civilians in that area about their need to flee, what they're thinking right now?
Well, I mean, I was staying in this one area near this resort, actually, and there were a few families who had bunkered there. And just talking to them, they were unsure where to go. I mean, the fact is they could have gone to a city called Saida, which is a bit north and is in theory in the safe zone, right, of Lebanon. But at the same time, the problem there is, of course, that you won't find a place to stay. There's no place to rent. And even if a landlord accepts to have you rent at this exorbitant price, they still might be worried about your origin, your background, etc. And these are people who have a very strong southern accent. So that would also be an issue. So, I mean, they actually went to Saida for the night to try to find a place to stay. They ended up sleeping on the streets and then came back to Tyre again, despite the evacuation order. And there are quite a few others like them.
Where do these attacks on Hezbollah leave the Lebanese government? There was a discussion about normalizing relations with Israel. I mean, is that totally out of the question now?
Well, so let's be clear. This whole issue of normalization with Israel, I mean, that came under duress of war. I mean, there's a desire for a ceasefire, that's for sure.
Among Lebanese people.
Correct. That's a whole different situation. Now, with that being said, the government has been trying to offer everything under the sun. It has offered direct negotiations with Israel, which it had not accepted at all in the past. It's offering this idea of normalization, which, of course, as I said, is really a red line for many people already in the country. And then tack on that it has already said that Hezbollah's military activities have all been outlawed. So again, we are talking about the government doing all the things that Israel had wanted it to do before the war. But Israel has said, it's too little too late. And this is where we are now.
So you've said that normalizing relations is not something in general that the Lebanese public wants. Is there a common desire to disarm Hezbollah?
I mean, I would argue there isn't a common desire. I think that desire has certainly increased, right? I think that's become a more dominant desire, especially in recent months, and especially this time around, because people were already so battered and so exhausted by the last war that this one really just came at a very, I think, difficult time for a lot of people. So for sure, the party has lost even more popularity, especially because it should be noted that it said that this was a vengeance strike for Khamenei. And so, I mean, the feeling here is that Iran can take care of itself. It's a far bigger country with far more resources. There was no need to embroil Hezbollah in this war. And Hezbollah, of course, has been trying to spin it differently since then, right, to say that this was a necessary war, etc., and that it was done only for Lebanon, not for anyone else. But as you can imagine, there is now a growing consensus among many Lebanese that they want Hezbollah to be disarmed. And certainly the government has so far moved towards the idea of outlawing Hezbollah's military activities. So we have seen some progress. Now, what that means in practice, of course, is the big question, because the government has proven unable to sort of apply any of these rules regardless.
Right.
I mean, the fact is that Hezbollah is a stronger force than the Lebanese army, and the Lebanese army refuses to actually engage with Hezbollah by force because that would risk a civil war.
Civil war, yeah. Well, if Hezbollah is not disarmed, what does Lebanon's future look like?
The fact of the matter is, Hezbollah had actually avoided fighting Israel for about 15 months before this war started. And this despite, I think, about 12,000 violations by Israel of the ceasefire. So Hezbollah had mentioned before that it was willing to maintain the ceasefire, it was willing to continue with this armament, etc., and all those other things if it saw some reciprocal move from Israel. And of course, that wasn't seen. So, I mean, we're in this catch-22 situation, right? And this continues.
What would Israeli officials say about your point that Hezbollah hadn't struck for about 15 months?
Well, they would say that it was trying to reconstitute itself in that time, and that it still had the ability to wage war, and that it couldn't be trusted to disarm. And so that brings us to where we are now.
What will you be watching in the days ahead to tell you whether de-escalation between Hezbollah and Israel is possible?
I think in the short term, that's not going to happen, right? The question is how much escalation we're going to see. Perhaps we're seeing a situation where the Israeli army proceeds to go up to a certain point in the country. And I suppose it'll take over that area in a security fashion and try to, I think, have a mini invasion, right? I don't think Israel would want to have a long-term occupation of that area just for various reasons. But I think for now, it would be happy to have some kind of security presence, and then it would remove Hezbollah and have the Lebanese army come and work in concert with it in some fashion.
Nabi, it is the holy month of Ramadan. We are nearing Eid, the celebration to break the fast. How is this fighting impacting the way that people are celebrating or experiencing Ramadan?
I mean, as you can imagine, people are not going to be having much of a Eid in this situation right now. I mean, at some level, it's a blessing because people are, of course, naturally more generous and perhaps people will be more amenable to helping others. But this over a million people who are now in the streets or in these shelters, it's going to be a very, very sad Eid indeed, especially because there is no horizon to this ending. It's unclear, what is the end game, whether it's in Iran or here, right? There just simply is no clarity.
Are you seeing increased generosity because it is Eid or people coming together more?
Of course, you hear stories of the situation here where people are opening up their homes. I mean, I'm on several WhatsApp groups where people are just going around gathering whatever they can, charity. I mean, of course, it should be said, the government really is unable to handle the situation. I mean, the Lebanese government is already dysfunctional, already has no money. And then to add to the situation of a war, people have as usual, taken up the slack left by the government. And they've been trying to help in various community ways. So, for example, I mean, even yesterday, I was on this WhatsApp group with a bunch of friends. They work in a bar together, and they decided to just come together and bring diapers and blankets and jackets, things of that nature, to people who are now staying in the Corniche seaside area, the seafront area of Beirut. So again, I mean, this is tiny and, of course, irrelevant in many ways. But, I suppose every little bit helps.
Yeah, and an example of how people do have practice coming together in times like this.
Exactly.
Nabi Boulos is the Middle East bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. He joined us from Beirut. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
International sports often play out in the shadow of global politics. If you were watching last night's final in the World Baseball Classic, you know exactly what I mean. It was the U.S. versus Venezuela.
Venezuela won against the U.S. with a double at the top of the ninth. Team captain and catcher Salvador Perez, a.k.a. Salvi, who plays for the Kansas City Royals, told the MLB network last night that winning this title for Venezuela was even bigger than winning the World Series for the Royals.
Yeah, it's a little bit more special because you play for your country. 30 million people in Venezuela. I know they're all happy right now. You guys know what's going on. Nothing I can hide it.
It's hard not to see what's going on. With all the political turmoil in Venezuela, Salvi says giving Venezuelans something to celebrate takes on added meaning.
It's a beautiful country, and I love the people from there, and I know Venezuelan people sing everywhere right now, and I know they're happy right now, so this will mean a lot for us.
In the world of soccer, Senegal has been stripped of its win in the Africa Cup of Nations. That decision was made last night by the Confederation of African Football. This came nearly 2 months after the Senegalese squad walked off the pitch in protest after behind-the-scenes drama before the match and a series of bizarre calls during the game.
It seems the players are being called off the park.
That was the reaction back in January from the announcer for Australian Network B in Sport. The Senegalese team has already said it will appeal the decision.
Staying with soccer, more news from the Iranian women's team. Earlier this month, 7 members were granted asylum in Australia. That was due to the danger they would likely face returning home after remaining silent as the Iranian national anthem was played before one of their matches. Now, 5 of the 7 have since withdrawn their bids for asylum, and all but 2 team members have now gone back to Iran. We will keep following that story.
Later in the show, home prices and rents have surged by up to 60% across the European Union over the past decade. But one capital is bucking the trend. Coming up, how Vienna makes housing affordable. You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. Public health officials are working to contain a meningitis outbreak in southeast England. 2 people have died, and the latest reports say about 20 people have confirmed cases. Health authorities have traced the source of the outbreak to a nightclub near the University of Kent. To learn more about what happened and why, I spoke with Devi Schreeder. She's the chair of Global Public Health at the University of Edinburgh, and started by explaining what meningitis is.
So meningitis refers to the inflammation of the tissues around the brain and the spinal cord, and it's caused by many sources, but in this case, it's meningococcal bacteria. This is a bacteria that lives in the throat. And what has happened is when you share drinks, think of saliva as a route of transmission, you share vapes, you share food, that gets shared. What's really scary about meningitis in this case is that this strain is making people severely ill, meaning within 24 hours, incredibly sick, life-threatening. And so I think that's why there's widespread panic, because university populations are already vulnerable to different infections because of, the social mixing and the way university students interact. But we have a treatment. Antibiotics are effective. If you get early intervention into hospital quickly, there are ways to avert some of the, more severe symptoms and lifelong impairments that can come. But also we do have an effective vaccine, the meningitis B vaccine. And so they are rolling that out. But it is quite scary. And I think that's why the public has been so concerned.
It's said the symptoms can resemble a hangover. What are the symptoms?
Well, I think this was what had happened with the first initial cases, because it's a really bad headache, a stiff neck, a fever, and then later on a rash usually develops. And so in the early stages, it can feel like you just feel really horrible the next day after drinking too much, which can almost overlap with some of those symptoms from if you were at a nightclub. And I think that's why, the advice has been check on your friends, make sure you're in touch with them, because if they're just at home and getting sicker and sicker, they might even get too sick to be able to ask for help.
Yeah, how has this particular outbreak been able to spread fairly quickly?
Well, I think what's been different is that usually with meningitis, you have individual cases and they're not necessarily linked. Here, what you've seen is actually a super spreading event similar to COVID. And so I think that's what's unique about this one, that actually all these cases are tied to one event that has occurred. And that is unusual, I think, for the pattern we have seen with meningitis.
So this is, as you said, specifically a strain of bacterial meningitis known as meningitis B. Most of these young people in the UK, whether they've been exposed or not, have not been vaccinated against this strain. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And why is that?
Well, the UK brought in meningitis B vaccination for those babies born after 2015. And the UK is different to the US in that it's a public system. So the NHS has to determine what is the benefit to the population of paying for a vaccine for everybody versus the cost of it to the health system. And at the time, because there weren't enough meningitis B cases out there to justify a widespread campaign, it wasn't seen as cost effective by JCVI, which is the agency that actually tells the government what vaccines they should procure and give to the population. That calculation might now change. So there are calls now to say, should we get a widespread vaccine campaign going? But it's difficult because of shortages. So, for example, and I can tell you in Britain, it's not available in any pharmacies. You cannot privately go and buy it. And the NHS doses are now being devoted to manage the Kent outbreak and the people most at risk there. So there is right now, I guess, similar to COVID, at the start, like the issue of doses and manufacturing enough, and actually, do we need to change in a longer term how we manage this in terms of bringing, meningitis B vaccination into the regular teenage vaccine schedule to catch up those who might have missed that 2015 date?
So I'm curious, what grade would you give to the public health response so far in the UK to this outbreak?
I'm always sure that, it's really hard. I think there's been criticism at the start about how slow some felt it took to connect these various cases and to say, oh, it was all linked, and then to contact the students and say they've been exposed. But I have to say recently they have picked up. They've, been doing the communications, the tracing. It's really difficult because in some ways it is a very random event. And I think we have to remember that sometimes random things happen, but it's in how quickly can you escalate and mount a response once, an outbreak has happened that would be hard to predict, let's say a week or two ago.
Well, one thing that we're reading is that pharmacies are actually running out of antibiotics. How are local health systems managing this?
It's really tricky. We know there are, shortages happening. At the same time, the way the NHS works is when there is a crisis, they redirect resources to that area. And so supply, which might be sitting in Scotland or somewhere else in the country, will be redirected.
We've been reading in the past decade about gradual chipping away at the UK's vaunted national health system, the NHS. Do you see any connection to the early response to this outbreak and the fact that it's even happening?
Yes, I think one of the challenges with the NHS, because it's a public system, people are reluctant to use it because they feel like they're taking on resources and it's easier if you can just manage at home. Just manage at home. Just take, paracetamol, Tylenol, whatever it might be. So I think there's a real challenge of a system which is bare-boned. And so now some of the public messaging has been go seek medical care. Don't sit at home thinking you can manage your own temperature if you're really feeling unwell and you think you've been exposed. And so I think it's just a reminder to be extra sensitive to those symptoms right now, given we know that this, at least in Kent, is circulating. And as we know how people travel, we're likely to see cases further afield too.
Devi Sridhar is the chair of Global Public Health at the University of Edinburgh.
This week, we are looking at the cost of putting a roof over your head in cities across the globe. In the European Union, home prices and rents have risen about 60% in the past decade. But one EU capital is bucking the trend. Vienna, where nearly 2/3 of the city's residents live in subsidized housing, and where people typically pay rent that's less than half of what it would cost in other European capitals. Vienna's approach is so successful that delegations from around the world go there to learn from it. Some people are worried, though, that changing political headwinds could turn the whole system on its head. The World's Europe correspondent Orla Berry reports from Vienna.
This is the living room. This is the work room. We can grow all vegetables, some tomatoes, pak choy.
Monica Reisinger, a 32-year-old mum of two, takes me on a tour of her flat. It's in a huge public housing complex called Alterla in the south of Vienna. Reisinger lives here with her partner and their two small children.
We have the whole garden area for us is pretty cool because our kids love to go outside and snack some strawberries or whatever they can find. So pretty amazing to have such a big garden space.
The flat has 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, an outside garden area and a swimming pool on the roof. The rent is less than $1,500. In most EU capitals, that'd barely get you a 1-bed. The complex is big, but there's greenery everywhere. Large plants draped on the outside of the blocks. And there's a park separating the buildings.
I just put my kids in their shoes and open the door and say, go to the park and I'll be there in 10 minutes. And I have absolutely no reason to be worried about that.
It's a far cry from social housing projects you'll find in many other European cities. And Vienna is so proud of its housing system, there's even a permanent exhibition dedicated to it in one of the city's oldest social housing complexes, called the Karl Marxhof. The exhibition isn't open every day though, so local guide Max Schranz gives me a private tour.
It is quite interesting.
The idea for the initiative goes back to the end of the First World War. Many of Vienna's 2 million residents were living in dire conditions.
People were crowded together in often one-room apartments that didn't have any infrastructure, didn't have running water, you didn't have your own toilet, you didn't have electricity in almost all cases, or heating.
So the Social Democratic government of the time set about building thousands of new apartments in 400 housing blocks across the capital. Their approach was also different from many other EU cities.
In Vienna, we don't think about social from the point of view of the poorest of the poor or something is missing. It's more the word of social comes from society. So it's societal housing.
Kurt Hofstetter is an urban planner with the city of Vienna. Housing is seen as a fundamental right here, he says, and close to 80% of Vienna's population qualifies for subsidised housing.
You can earn quite nice money, really good money, and still have access to the system of affordable housing.
And once you're in, you can stay for life, even if your salary doubles or triples. Hofstetter says a central feature of Vienna's social housing policy is that people from different backgrounds and incomes get to live together, so no area ends up being just for the wealthy or the poor. But not everyone is eligible.
Asylum seekers cannot access municipal housing.
Daniel Zipfel is with the charity Caritas that works with the vulnerable in Vienna. Around 17,000 asylum seekers live in the city, he says, but they only have access to private rental accommodation, and the conditions are generally not good.
The apartments they live in are mostly substandard apartments. It's many people on small space, and in general they have to pay little rent, but for very bad quality of accommodation.
Tenants living in some of the city's social housing complexes have complained about the condition of their apartments too, says housing researcher Alexis Munt.
That is a big issue, especially the older municipal stock. It's owned by the city of Vienna, and in the last decade or so, Vienna has financial troubles because they also have very high costs.
Still, Munt says the vast majority of people in Vienna are content to rent for life.
So Vienna has always been a rental city. This has been the case forever. It's now 75% at least that are renters and not owners. And people are perfectly happy to stay renters for all their life.
Vienna has been ruled mainly by the left-wing Social Democratic Party, and that's helped preserve its affordable housing policy, Munt says. But nationally, the far-right Freedom Party is topping the polls in Austria. And if it gets back into government, experts worry that Vienna's housing model could suffer. Kurt Hofstetter, the urban planner, says at least that's what happened the last time they were in power, from 2017 to 2019.
The first thing they did was cut the affordable housing system, sell it to private companies. The finance minister of this time is in jail now because he took money. So that's what would happen.
The housing stock that was sold off to private investors has never been acquired by the council again, he says. Once it goes, it's almost impossible to get it back, he says. Mum of two, Monica Reisinger, says she worries too about what the popularity of the far right might mean for housing in her city.
It makes me very sad, and I hope that something changes and the people get to know which treasure it is, that we don't have to own our space and that it is so affordable to live here.
Our public housing policy is a national treasure, she says, and we have to do everything we can to protect it. For The World, I'm Orla Barry, Vienna.
In El Salvador, the Legislative Assembly has just approved an amendment to the Constitution that would sentence murderers, rapists, and terrorists to life in prison. Interestingly, it changes a part of the country's constitution that is intended to protect against life sentences. El Salvador has been in a state of emergency for 4 years, imposed by the country's authoritarian leader, Nayib Bukele, and his draconian crackdown on criminal gangs. Critics warn that the strongman president has also been tightening his grip on power. Jorge Cuellar joined us today from Dartmouth College, where he's an assistant professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies.
So the concern among Salvadoran people is, and critics of the regime, is that in fact this makes permanent the carceral turn in El Salvador. So from 2021, with the state of exception, right, there's been a slow erosion of all the democratic levers of government. And this is one of the final things in the penal code that at least allowed for people who were incarcerated to have a semblance of possibly getting out, right? But with this lifetime sentence, Salvadorans now are going to be jailed for life and often under dubious accusations and circumstances.
I'm curious, what is Bukele telegraphing by singling out these three groups, murderers, rapists, and terrorists? How will Salvadorans read that?
Yeah, so Salvadorans are thinking about this in the same way that Bukele has been repeating since the start of his administration. He's really conjuring up this boogeyman type figure, right, with the gangs and the murderers and the terrorists, in order to point out that if they don't vote for this and if they don't accept this reform to the penal code, then these people are going to get out. They're going to be back on the streets again. They're going to be in your communities. They're going to be extorting you. They're going to be killing your relatives. This is the kind of thing that he's mobilizing.
So today, if you were to commit a crime in one of these categories, where typically does due process kick in El Salvador?
Well, see, due process and the rule of law in that kind of way, based on what Bukele has done in remaking the judicial system, placing loyalist judges across all different levels, all the way from the municipalities to the departmental to the national, there's no real due process at this point. It's be jailed and detained while questions are being asked. Pre-trial detention is common, and folks are being sent to local jails, but also one of the many maximum security prisons, such as Izalco and Mariona, but also the famed totemic Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, right? That also really looms large as part of the way that this government is addressing the problem of criminality and deviancy as they define it.
So this reform of the Constitution follows a report last week by independent legal experts that independent legal experts that Bukele and his Justice Department are committing crimes against humanity. They're saying that the Bukele government is committing crimes against humanity. What exactly is being alleged?
What we're seeing here with the report is a long-term study of these security policies that the government has pushed forward that have expanded beyond the initial rationale, which was gang suppression. And now it's become something that is wholesale targeting all forms of dissent and incompatibility with the regime, that has purged much of the democratic institutionality of the country, including the Attorney General's office and all sorts of things.
And Jorge, how has the Salvadoran government responded to those charges?
This is what's interesting with the Bukele government. Every time that it's cornered in a very visible and public way, where Bukele seems that he's losing control of the narrative, that narrative which is so valuable to him, right? That everything is under control, that, my enlightened leadership is moving this country forward from the dark ages. Look at all the shiny new buildings that we have, from the library to the airport, right? How we're tourist friendly now. So he returns to a kind of spectacular mode of discourse in social media, especially, which is sort of the ideological battleground for a lot of this stuff, and responds very forcefully.
The fact that El Salvador's Justice Minister, Gustavo Villatoro, spent a lot of his time yesterday in the national legislature excoriating these human rights groups for their criticism and concern about crimes against humanity being committed in El Salvador's prisons, he told them to go to hell. What does that tell you about the intent of this new law, or how El Salvador's government is positioning itself?
Yeah, no, that was you spent quite a bit of time going after the human rights organizations. I think there's been a war against the concept of human rights that has been longstanding in El Salvador ever since Bukele arrived, and this is a kind of another high point in that war from the Bukele perspective. There's also a clear sense, by the way, that the government articulates its notion of humanity, that those that are in the system and that have committed crimes based on their arbitrary criteria are actually unhuman, inhuman. And so it's really operating on that kind of level. And this is why the evidence in that report can so easily be dismissed.
Although we should say, Jorge, that President Bukele's popularity remains high in El Salvador despite criticism for human rights violations and the erosion of these rights that you were talking about. Do you have a sense of how Salvadorans are responding to this latest constitutional move?
I mean, it's really quite interesting the way that the international press often does not correspond to the kinds of local conversations that people are having around these issues. Because of Bukele's mode of governance, there's been a kind of chilling effect in society where people actually don't speak quite frankly about their distaste for some of Bukele's policies, the administering of government. So it's really kind of difficult to assess that part. But what is clear is that there's been many groups, many of who are now in exile in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Costa Rica, in Spain, in the US, right, that have been pointing out these incoherencies and violent excesses of the state for a long time. And it's only when they're aggrieved more directly, a family member gets arbitrarily detained, or they're forced to migrate because there's a corrupt cop who is abusing his power, right? Or a military or soldier. It's until then that you start seeing these kinds of stories. But again, this doesn't get reflected in polling oftentimes because of this chilling effect around being critical of the regime.
I'm speaking with Jorge Cuellar at Dartmouth College about a tough new law in El Salvador enforcing life sentences for a range of criminals. Still, though, I mean, is there a good portion of the population that simply feels safer now and embraces the idea that criminals, this category of rapists, murderers, and terrorists, that they are subhuman or at least deserve the punishment they're getting?
Indeed, no, I think there is still indeed a sense that this is what these class of subhumans deserve. And that's part of the challenge, right? When even the language of human rights and humanity itself is something that has been totally redefined.
Now, Justice Minister Villatoro says that human rights groups are demanding the government release all of the gang members who have been given 1,000-year prison sentences. Is that, in fact, the demand of the human rights organizations?
No, that is not the demand. They want the human rights organizations, first of all, want the release of political prisoners. That's one thing that the state of exception and this kind of arbitrary detention approach by the government has produced.
So it's effectively the state of emergency that we've been talking about.
There are many people that are in state custody that have never experienced a real, transparent judicial proceeding. Many people are experiencing torture within the system. And there's a lot of people who have been incorrectly caught in the dragnet.
So a lot of these gang members this law applies to are detained at the Sikot Maxi prison, which you were talking about a moment ago. It's also where Salvadorans deported by ICE have ended up with no due process. According to Human Rights Watch, 9,000 Salvadorans were deported back to their home country from the U.S. And in recent days, they're also reporting 10% had criminal convictions in the U.S., and now a number of them in El Salvador have been disappeared. What can you tell us about what those people are currently up against as this new law goes through?
With this kind of carceral relationship between El Salvador and the United States, this is coming for Salvadoran Americans, right, who are differentially documented in the U.S. For those people who are sent back with this new arrangement, they're basically very very much kind of conflated with the rapist, the murderer, the terrorist, the gang member, right? They're part of this. The criminal deportee is another category there as well, part of that series of social types that are undesirable. I see those folks up against a very similar carceral system where they're unlikely to get any support and legal representation. I mean, just remember the experience of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, where it took moving mountains to make that case visible and to get at least the U.S. government to respond, right?
Jorge, you have family in El Salvador. What are you hearing from them about all of this, and how does what you hear about their experiences track with what international rights groups are saying?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you are in El Salvador and how close you are to the projects that the government is propelling. From my family's point of view, Bukele hasn't quite impacted them quite as directly as it has other people in other sectors. I'm thinking here of informal vendors, people who live near the Rio Lempa, who live in places like Cabañas, where there's a lot of mining activity that's being reactivated. It depends on sort of where you're standing in the country.
Jorge, where do things in El Salvador go from here?
See, I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but I think that there is a sense that Bukele is here to stay. He's reformed the electoral law to extend his appointment for 6 years. It used to be 5. Now re-election that's in play that is new, that has been reactivated for the express purpose of his reproducing himself in the executive. And so I think it's just more of Bukele.
That was Jorge Cuellar at Dartmouth College in the Department of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies.
This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. When it comes to end-of-life wishes, some people weigh the environmental impact of, for example, a burial versus cremation. In Denmark, the remains of those who are cremated often help heat the homes of the living. As The World's Joshua Coe learned, cities there are recycling heat from their local crematoriums. And just a warning, some details in his report are not for the squeamish.
Right now I'm standing next to the incinerator inside of crematorium. and I'm watching as a coffin is being put in position to go into the incinerator.
Seeing a cremation for the first time is sobering. I look on as the white casket trundles slowly along a conveyor belt, to be swallowed up by this red-hot inferno of the incinerator. Once the door closes, temperatures inside will rise up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, reducing the casket and the corpse to ash.
I don't know if this is too morbid, but does anything ever remain other than the ashes?
Yeah. All, spare parts.
Jarek Park Bisgård is an engineer here at the municipal crematorium in Aalborg. In a room behind the incinerator, he pulls out a bin.
Yeah. This is all the parts that's inside the bodies. You see, this is hips right here. I used to call them spare parts.
I peered down at a grim clutter of scorched metal, hips, knees, surgical screws, the spare parts. And as Bisgård shows me, this is just one of the practical ways we give back even after we're no more.
Right now it goes to a company in the Netherlands, so we can reuse this for new parts.
For people's hips?
Yeah. So nothing, because that metal, the titanium, is so expensive.
So the ashes go to the loved ones, titanium goes to new hip replacements, and the rest of the body, that goes up in smoke, in the form of water vapor, carbon dioxide, and, if not for the mandatory filtration system, gaseous chemicals like chlorine and mercury. But straight out of the incinerator, those cadaverous flue gases are blazing hot, too hot for the filtration system to handle. So first, they head down to the basement, where they're water-cooled in one of the big, humming boilers.
These boilers here exchange the heat from the flue gases and heat up the return water in the district heating system.
So the water cools the gas, and in return, the gas heats the water. In most scenarios, the transferred heat would just go to waste. But here in Waste Not, Want Not, Denmark, that heat gets a second life, as hot water piped into household radiator systems.
So this waste heat, we reuse that for heating up houses.
On an average day, the system here at the crematorium can generate enough heat for about 45 homes. Bisgård says that when the system was first discussed a couple decades ago, there were some ethical questions raised about whether this was using dead people as fuel. And that came with some quintessential Danish humor.
There was a lot of jokes about that back then. And I read in the newspaper that there was a little drawing with an old man sitting in his, rocking chair or something. And then you saw that behind him, that radiator.
As you may know, radiators are notoriously loud as they start to warm up.
And he was kind of hitting that radiator, and saying that even when you're dead, you can't leave me alone. And that was, of course, about his deceased wife. It's like, but that's very Danish humor. Very Danish.
Very dark humor.
Yeah, dark and Danish.
When I asked Danes about all this in Aalborg city center, most people didn't know that cremating their mortal remains could help heat their neighbors' homes. There was some surprise, but also some of that Danish gallows humor.
I'm an organ donor anyways, so, maybe not all of me would go back into the city anyways.
Tor Origor, a tall and thin 25-year-old, says it doesn't bother him all that much. His only concern is that he doesn't have that much to contribute.
I doubt my body would provide a whole lot of energy, but everything's contributing a bit, I guess.
For 59-year-old Marianne Hjonegård, helping to warm homes someday is about lessening the impact of climate change.
I think in 2026 we have to see what we can do in order to make a better environment. Everything counts. I think it's a good idea. I wasn't aware of it. I think it's a good idea.
If Danish humor is all about the gallows, Danish society is all about sustainability, and recapturing so-called waste heat fits into a broader push for efficiency and energy security. Places like supermarkets or crematoriums only heat a few dozen homes here, but the heat generated by a nearby cement plant, that contributes about a quarter of Aalborg's heating needs. The dream is to tap into industries that currently let all their excess heat go to waste.
It can also be data centers, because when they cool the servers, they're producing a lot of heat. And then the local district heating company or district energy company buys that heat and then supplies heating for the city.
Peter Sorkness researches energy systems at Aalborg University. He says industrial-scale waste heat can warm a lot of homes. But creating a heating network, all those pipes running under buildings, that can be a big investment, and it's not without risks.
Because once you have the heating network, you need to make an agreement with the data center or the industry. And that agreement is important to make and difficult to make because you don't know if that industry or data center is there in 3 or 4 years. And that is something you have to take into account. There's a risk.
At least in Denmark, crematoriums are far less risky. The country has one of the highest cremation rates in the world. Well over 80% of the deceased end up cremated. And that rate is only going up, says Bisgaard, that engineer with the city crematoriums.
And that's why right now we are thinking about building a whole new crematorium with at least 3 incinerators instead of 2. Because in a few years, we don't have the capacity.
There might be capacity concerns inside the crematoria, but outside in the cemeteries, there's a different sort of capacity issue. These days, there just aren't enough bodies that need burying.
You can actually physically, in the cemeteries, see what is going on. That because of more and more people choose to be cremated, we need smaller and smaller graves out here because that urn is so small.
As we look out at the cemetery here in Aalborg, a faint gray smoke wafts up from the crematorium's chimney. That smoke, it still contains CO2, a major greenhouse gas that's heating up the planet. Bisgaard says they're still working out what to do about that. For The World, I'm Joshua Coe in Aalborg, Denmark.
Finally today, a quick note that makes transformers look like, well, toys.
Scientists at the University of Edinburgh have engineered E. coli bacteria to break down plastic bottles to make a drug called L-Dopa that's used to treat Parkinson's disease. The drug is usually produced using fossil fuels.
This new discovery both recycles plastic and reduces the need for fossil fuels in the process. That's all on top, of course, of treating Parkinson's.
The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Thanks as always for listening.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. LuminaFoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Judy Piggott, the Gruber Family Foundation, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and Gavin Salmonese, LLC. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.